So today I'm working on this Godzilla project. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about Godzilla video games and nuclear representation. So I want to start out by going to my next slide. There we go. I want to start out by saying that I love Godzilla. And the genesis of this project is literally just a friend of mine is running a conference in Buffalo on Japanese games, and I needed to write about something. And when I sat to think about what I wanted to write about, I thought, I've actually never written anything about Godzilla before. So that is where this started. And like a lot of my projects, it's expanded and spiraled out of control. And it's probably going to take me a few years to get through, but I'm really excited to be working on this. But like as a little bit of a background, like Godzilla's got like a soft spot for me. My mom and uncle always tell me stories about like growing up in Canada watching Godzilla movies on Saturday mornings. Because that's on Canadian TV. They just dumped a bunch of like cheap that cheap content for kids. And one of the things that they got was like a lot of Godzilla and Ultraman movies. So the more that I think about it, I think Godzilla might be one of my entry points into like Japanese culture and why I like love Japan and study Japan. Because unlike a lot of people, for me, it's not anime and manga. Like I watch a little anime and I read a little manga, but it really is just like history books and Godzilla and maybe a little bit of Pokemon. And then of course Japanese video games, but Godzilla is one of like the constants for me. So this is a labor of love, so to speak, but it's also a thing that I've passed on to onto my niece and nephew. So they are 8 and 3, and they both absolutely love Godzilla and everything about him. But it's also one of the things that got me thinking about this project is like, what does Godzilla mean to people? Few things that I wanted to say to start with. So interestingly enough, in Japan, Godzilla doesn't have a gender. It's referred to as more like a force of nature. But in Western society, we usually say he. Like the monster was gendered very early on and gets called he. I have a tendency to call Godzilla he, so I'm gonna like stick with that today. The other thing that I wanted to say is that I'm well aware that he is not Godzilla in Japan. It's Gojira, but I'm just going to go with Godzilla for simplicity's sake, except for like one example here as we move through. But yeah, I love Godzilla. I'm really happy to get a chance to talk about him today. So the first thing that I want to do is go into a little bit of the history of Godzilla, because that's one of the things that I do, and I want to connect it into the studies that I do in collective memory. So one question that comes up a lot is Godzilla about the atomic bombs? From a Western perspective, that's typically like the surface level understanding is that like, oh, Hiroshima and Nagasaki were hit by atomic weapons at the end of World War II. And because of that, that's what Godzilla is about. But interestingly enough, it's kind of not what Godzilla is about. And I want to go through this step by step because sometimes when you read about this, people tend to skip right to 1954 and be like, this is what Godzilla is about. And they take like the last thing or the last two things and say, this is where the movie comes from. But I think that there's some historical basis that's actually pretty interesting to work through here too. So where does Godzilla come from, a collective memory perspective? So one of the most important things to remember, of course, at the end of World War II is that there was the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But one thing that a lot of people don't know is that literally almost all of Japan, all of the major cities have been leveled through conventional bombing, through naval attacks, through the atomic bombings. In fact, in the latter half of 1945, when we were coming towards the end of the war, there were only 5 Japanese cities that were still standing: Hiroshima, Nagasaki, Niigata, Kokura, and Kyoto were the only cities that were still there. From those names, I'm sure that you can imagine why they were cities that were still standing. And that was because the Americans had started to reserve cities that were going to be potential atomic bomb targets. So Hiroshima and Niigata were one potential set, with Hiroshima being the primary target and Niigata being the secondary target. And Kokura was actually supposed to be the primary target of the second atomic bomb, but it was too cloudy and there was smoke from a previous raid at a nearby city. So on that day, the pilots went on to Nagasaki. Kyoto was only saved because Henry Stimson, who was he held a lot of different high-level posts in the U.S. government during the war, but he had been stationed as like an attaché in Kyoto, which has a very interesting history because of being Kyoto means old capital as opposed to Tokyo meaning new capital. When you like translate that into English, but Kyoto is in a very interesting like position geographically within the country, where there tend to be less natural disasters like typhoons or tsunamis or anything that would cause like major fires. And because of that, unlike a lot of the other cities in Japan, Kyoto had a lot of like older architecture, older buildings, and a lot of that. So Stimson thought that it was like a particularly beautiful city, and he fought throughout the war to make sure that it wouldn't be targeted. So the way that he went about this was he first tried to get the city reserved as one of the atomic bomb targets, which he was successful with. And then when it came time to actually pick the final targets, Stimson made sure that it wasn't Kyoto that got targeted. But the important thing to pull out of all of this is that at the end of World War II, almost all of Japan was leveled. Just a general destruction of the entirety of the country. Then something that comes like right out of this is that there was really heavy censorship by the US occupation. So a major part of this censorship was getting rid of a lot of like Japanese propaganda that had been used during World War II, but also starting to shape the narrative of what was and wasn't allowed to be told in media in post-war, the immediate post-war Japan. And one of the things that they censored really, really heavily was a lot of the destruction of the cities, but especially Hiroshima and Nagasaki. There's a really interesting early example of why this ended up happening, because a Western writer, John Hersey, actually went into Hiroshima and was able to interview, I think it's between 5 and 6 people, and wrote this famous book, wrote this famous piece called Hiroshima, which was originally published in 1946 as a full issue of the New Yorker, and then later became like a book club style book that that was a bestseller in 1946, 1947 United States. And the book was very, very graphic and told exactly what had happened in Hiroshima. And it was a really bad look for the American military, for the American government, particularly because at that time they were still trying to argue through official channels that while the atomic bombs had been horrible, that like they were contained events, and that there's some famous like writing where they were like, nobody would die from atomic bomb injuries or illnesses like after 6 months post bombing, and all of this became like very evidently false with books like what Hersey was writing. Another author, a journalist named George Weller, got into Nagasaki and wrote some similar stuff, and was fully censored. He sent away his drafts to the occupation authorities so that he could publish them, and they were actually withheld and not published, and found basically by accident decades later. So you can read Weller's book now. It's called First into Nagasaki. But even then, Weller had to like sneak into Nagasaki to get like his notes and to write his books. But because of that, because of the success of the Hersey book, the occupation authorities really very seriously censored anything that was coming out of Japan. So Japan's got a very rich hibakusha literature. Hibakusha is a term used for a person who survived the atomic bombs or is affected by them. So thinking like children in utero or children of atomic bomb victims are considered to be hibakusha. But that it means in English, bomb-affected persons would be the full translation of that. That movement of them writing either fictional stories based on their experiences or even just non-fictional, just their experiences, doesn't really start until the 1970s. I believe it's like 1975 in around there. So even within a memory context, there's not a lot about the atomic bombs in going on in the when it comes to the what's going on in World War II. What is on that screen over there? Yeah, that's not coming from me. Where's that coming from? For those of you who are in the chat right now, one of the screens has a bunch of chickens on it.
Fantastic.
Yeah, and I just saw that, and I was anyway, I was wondering if it was like showing pictures off of my computer, but it's not. It's showing pictures from somewhere. Someone is cast into the room, so we've got Godzilla on one side and like chickens and stuff on the other. All right, that's it was very distracting because I see everybody like looking over my shoulder and smiling and stuff like that, which didn't seem appropriate for the content, but now it does. Okay. All right. So just tying up that last point. So the Hibakusha literature movement doesn't really take off and doesn't have like widestream success until I think 1975 is when Abuse publishes Black Rain. Although that might be the English version. Regardless, that is not a thing that takes off right away within Japan itself. There's also the peace movement and peace education. I was going to say movements. So there's the peace movement and peace education, which is essentially just something that started in Hiroshima specifically, where they would, the point is it's a protest movement to outlaw atomic weapons and then nuclear weapons and then like hydrogen bombs. And has also moved on to be against nuclear power as well. And this is well before even the Fukushima incident. So this is something that is developing in Japan at the time. I believe like the first meeting of the peace movement happens in Hiroshima in like 1946 or 1947. But even then, it is not something that is like mainstream within a Japanese memory context. So take all of this into account in the 1940s and 50s before we're approaching Godzilla, is that the atomic bombs are not really a thing that many normal or that the Japanese population is thinking about. Everybody experienced some kind of destruction. There was a lot of censorship. And even like popular culture is not getting the opportunity to put these things out yet. So then we get into the Cold War and nuclear testing and weapons development. And this is where we start to see the genesis of where Godzilla comes from. So obviously, post 1945 and before Godzilla's original Godzilla's release in 1954, we've got, from a Japanese perspective, you've got the Chinese Civil War happening, and then shortly thereafter, the Korean War, which obviously neither were nuclear conflicts, but always had the potential to be nuclear conflicts, particularly with the United States having many military bases in Japan. And there was always an argumentation about whether they should be nuclear military bases as well. So all of these things are happening, and we finally get ourselves up into 1953. An interesting thing that you'll read somewhere, and I'm not sure how true it is all the time, is that some of the makers of the movies, like we have to take into account that they also just kind of wanted to make a really great movie. So this American movie, The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, gets referenced a lot as an influence for the Godzilla franchise coming out the year before. I think there's some stuff by some of the creators being like, we saw this movie and we thought that it was really cool. So this is one thing that you'll see is like, this is where Godzilla comes from, is influenced by this movie. But the big thing comes from this vessel called Daigo Fukuryu Maru, or the Lucky Dragon. In 1954, the Americans were conducting secret hydrogen bomb tests in the Bikini Atoll, which is in the Pacific. And because they were secret, they were not, necessarily like keeping the Japanese government informed of this. So the Lucky Dragon was a fishing vessel that was out in the Pacific catching, I believe it was like tuna. And after one of the tests at Bikini Atoll, they got caught in the fallout of that bombing, but they didn't know that they got caught in the fallout of the bombing. So they returned to Tokyo with their full catch, and all of the fish in there were sold and went out into society. Shortly thereafter, all of the sailors started to show symptoms of atomic illnesses, nuclear illnesses, and because Japan's doctors had a lot of experience in that, they were able to like pick up on it right away. And this caused like a panic throughout Japan because the fish had been sold, so people were concerned about that. And the Godzilla movie comes out, I believe, 6 to 8 months afterwards. And this is considered to be the incident of like where Godzilla comes from. So taking all of this into account, I like to go a little bit further back, because some people will just be like, oh, this incident happened and that's where Godzilla comes from. But it's this confluence of things that is happening. The censorship, the wide-scale destruction in Japan, of course, the atomic bombings being in there, and then other world events that really shape where the original Godzilla movie comes from. So I keep talking about the original film, and there's actually two original films. One that was released in Japan and one that was released in the West. So how many of you have seen the original Godzilla film? By like show of hands. Michael kind of went, eh. So I'm actually a little bit shocked that it's zero. Normally I'm up here talking about obscure like Japanese RPGs. I'm like, nobody knows what this is. This is Godzilla. I thought one person would have seen the film. All right, I'm gonna have to take a second to reset here. So there are two versions of the original Godzilla movie. The screenshots here are actually taken from Tubi. You can watch both of these for free. I watched one of them last night, and oh, do I have some thoughts about the American version. But you have Gojira, the 1954 version, that is the original film, and then it was very successful. So like within a year, it got picked up to be to be shown like in American theaters. But as was the as were the times, they were like, we want to put this movie out, but there's no white actor in it, so we can't, like, nobody's going to want to watch this. So what they did is they took the original film and they cut out a bunch of parts of it, and then they filmed new content with this white actor named Raymond Burr and just inserted him into the film. And oh my goodness, watching this film is just like, it's a trip, man. It is so like unintentionally funny, because it also shows you a lot about like what people knew about the planet, because in the opening, like the opening scene, he narrates a lot of this. There's also just a lot of this actor narrating what is happening. And they didn't even get rid of the Japanese voices, but he's narrating the beginning of this film, and he says that he's in Tokyo because he was going to see a colleague in Cairo and decided to make a stopover. I don't understand what this flight is or how people understood geography at the time. If he starts in Los Angeles, you would think that he's flying directly to Tokyo. He's not flying across the country to Cairo. If he starts in New York, I still don't think that you're going to fly to Tokyo and then all the way around to Cairo. So it doesn't make sense. The best that I can describe it is just this idea of the Orient, and they're both like, those are both in the Orient, so they must be close together, not realizing it's like the other side of the planet. So that part of it is really hilarious. The other thing that is just great is the way that they handle a lot of his scenes. Is he's just kind of like standing in the back in this like immaculate suit, smoking a pipe, talking to his interpreter, who is this like Japanese military guy, maybe. It's not really like described. And it's funny enough that he's just like going into all these high level like meetings. But at one point they're out on this tropical island to go and see Godzilla, and he's still walking around in his leather shoes with his suit, smoking his pipe in what must be like 40 degrees Celsius weather. It's just, it's really hilarious. But pulling back and the actual like content of these films, one of the really interesting things about the end of the original Godzilla, spoilers, is that there is a scientist named Dr. Serizawa, and he has more or less like accidentally found this super weapon that's called the oxygen destroyer. And when it's dropped into the water, this is science fiction, so like I don't think there's any science to support this. But when it's dropped into the water, the idea is that it destroys all the oxygen, which will kill all life in water. And for Tokyo Bay, they probably only need something like the size of a basketball. So Serizawa sees that there's been multiple Godzilla attacks, but he doesn't want to tell the world about this weapon that he's created because he's concerned about the implications of that weapon being used. And he's concerned not only about it being used for against Godzilla, but he's thinking that once it's used, everyone will get access to it and it will be used again. So there's that angle to it. But it goes deeper than this. He's also concerned that his work is going to be stolen and used by potentially by nefarious people. And even if he destroys all of the notes, someone can get him. And even the idea that the knowledge exists in his brain is dangerous. So Serizawa decides that he does not want to use the oxygen destroyer. And then there's this wonderful scene where this television broadcast comes on and the children of Tokyo are singing this like song for peace, which would take a very long time to describe the significance of that, like vis-a-vis World War II, but has a cultural significance to it and makes Serizawa decide that he's going to destroy all of his research and then make one last batch of this oxygen destroyer so they can go and kill Godzilla. At the end of the film, he decides not to come up because they have to go down in scuba suits to release this thing. He cuts his line and decides to die with Godzilla so that the knowledge of the oxygen destroyer dies with him. And it's very clearly a commentary on Oppenheimer and on the use of scientific knowledge, the use of weapons of mass destruction, and the responsibility of those in power to not use them. The American version cuts out almost all of this. And instead of this long, like 10-minute scene in the lab where they're deciding this, it's like a minute long. And Serizawa's like, I don't want to use this. What if somebody else gets it? And then they're like, well, you should use it anyway. And he decides to use it. Which is a very interesting commentary on the way that Americans think about weapons of mass destruction at the time. Not that weapons of mass destruction are inherently bad, but they can be bad when the right people don't have them. So we can use them, but the wrong people could get them, and that's why they are dangerous, which is a very nuanced but an interesting way of looking at these films. I could go on about these for the entirety of this talk. So I'm going to move on and just say to you, I know a lot of people have probably seen some of the newer Godzilla movies or have seen some of the stuff from the 80s where he's like flying, karate kicking space aliens and those sorts of things. And those are wonderful. And I don't want to take those away from anyone because those are great films, but I want to like pull back and be like, the original ones were really excellent films that were about something. They weren't just like action monster movies. Recently, Shigeru Koyama in concert with the director and one other person. But one thing that he did a couple of years or within a year of the first two movies coming out, Godzilla and Godzilla Raids Again, is he turned those treatments into short stories and then published them for mass consumption. And they only recently got translated into English for the first time in the past like year, as far as I can tell. So I got the chance to read it recently, and they're really, really good. But he frames the beginning of these stories with this quote, which I'm going to read here. As you readers already know, the main character of this tale, Godzilla, is an enormous imaginary kaiju, a creature that doesn't actually exist anywhere here on the planet. However, atomic and hydrogen bombs, which have taken on the form of Godzilla in this story, do exist. They are being produced and could be used for war at any moment. If that were to happen, it wouldn't just be big metropolises like Tokyo, and Osaka that would be destroyed, the entire Earth would likely be laid to waste. To prevent something so frightening and tragic from coming to pass, people all over the world are pouring their energy into a new movement opposing the use of hydrogen bombs. As a small member of that movement, I have tried to do my part by writing a novel, the tale that you now hold in your hands. Reading this book in that context will make it all the more informative and interesting. So even the guy who is writing this is very much framing the original Godzilla film and the second Godzilla film as critiques of the hydrogen bombs that were being made in the 1950s. Interestingly, Kayama did not write any more of the Godzilla movies after the first two, because he was concerned that Godzilla was being turned into a mascot, and that people were starting to find him cute, and were starting to like develop a bond with Godzilla that was pro Godzilla. So for the original people like creating this, Godzilla was supposed to be a scary monster that you hated. And then that changed over time into like people like me being like, I love Godzilla, and having Godzilla's like in their house, and he is very much a mascot in that way. But Kayama very much distanced himself from that really early on when he saw that happening. All right, so this pulls into like what I'm actually doing with this new project. So what about Godzilla video games? One thing that strikes me as like so very interesting is that all these things that I've just told you are generally considered like these aren't really big arguments within the academic community. People who like study Godzilla is like, yeah, Godzilla is very much anti-nuclear, part of the anti-nuclear movement, and is still important in Japan because of that. But I think it gets taken for granted. And I realized this within game studies because Godzilla has been in dozens of games. And even some of the people who write about Japanese games will mention Godzilla as being part of like the anti-nuclear movement. But no one's actually studied Godzilla games for their content and gone into that and looked into see if they are actually like anti-nuclear. So for this paper that I'm going to be writing in the summer, I picked 5 Godzilla games to just analyze their content and talk about whether they are anti-nuclear or not. The reason that I had so much preamble in this talk is because having studied the games now, they don't. It's just really simple. They don't. There's not a ton to say there. There's maybe a little bit of it. And I think the argumentation is going to be more around the nuance of, okay, the content isn't there, but is this character so inherently like anti-nuclear that these games get looped into this anti-nuclear movement because he's just like a symbol, like maybe a semiotics of Godzilla. I'm not going to write that. I'll use something different. But so a couple of the games I picked here, we've got on the left, we've got Godzilla Destroy All Monsters Melee, made by Pipeworks Software in 2003. And on the right, we've got Godzilla Defense Force, made by, I think it's Neeple and Studio 42 in 2019. The Destroy All Monsters is a really popular thing to do with the Godzilla franchise, is to take Godzilla and all the other monsters that he's fought and put them into a fighting game. They're really fun, but there's not really a new anti-nuclear commentary there. It's just your literal 2D or 3D fighter. You got 2 characters, they fight until their health bars go down. Within Destroy All Monsters, you get to like destroy buildings and stuff with it too. So that part, like the destruction of the city, which of course will always like as a symbol like resemble destroyed cities at the end of World War II, is there. But that's really not the commentary that's going on. It's just fun to destroy cities. It's fun to pick up an entire building as Godzilla and throw it at Rodan. Like that's the gameplay structure there. Also, if I recall correctly, Godzilla Destroy All Monsters plays on this. There's like a really interesting trope in the later Godzilla movies where aliens invade the Earth and take over monsters and then use the monsters to destroy the Earth. And then Godzilla, not being able to be mind controlled, goes and fights all the other monsters. It's beautiful storytelling, wonderful to watch. And the games kind of like go with that one most of the time too. You just are the monster that's not like being mind controlled. Godzilla Defense Force is like a clicking it's not really an infinite clicker. It's kind of a base building, card collecting. It's a mobile game. It's a combination of all those things that are shiny colors and make you want to like keep playing. Where you are defending the Earth from monsters. And you collect cards. As you collect cards, those monsters get to be on your team. And once again, it's just aliens using giant monsters. So you just like you play through this game. No real anti-nuclear commentary there. It's just I'll admit, like, I enjoy both of these games. And I'm not really a big mobile game person. They usually don't hold my interest, but they make good use of the license. And then they also have this whole one of the big things is that they've got this like album where you can go and see all of the cards and then read about the different monsters in different movies and films and stuff. So it really capitalizes on like the history and the fandom. So because of that, you know, you've got like the original Godzilla in there, and there's some mention in these entries on each monster sometimes of like nuclear weapons or things like that. But in the what are we at now? Like 70 years that Godzilla has existed. He's fought everything from like pollution to a race of all female aliens that I believe they called femalians. And what else? Like biological experimentation, like a plant that's like the mix of some scientist daughter's DNA and Godzilla DNA and everything. So there's like fights against genetics and all these things. So once again, not a ton of anti-nuclear commentary. One interesting game that I did find that is, I don't know what to make of it yet, is that the English translation is City Shrouded in Shadow. It's made by this company called Godzilla, who have this really interesting history. They make this series called Disaster Report, which is just you create this character and then there's an earthquake and you just kind of like navigate out of cities to to survive the earthquake or like the mini like fall of society. And then they got this license and released this game only in Japan that is a similar thing, but it's like monsters attack. So they've got Ultraman in there. They've got all these like mech series and everything like that. But Godzilla appears in a couple of the levels. And this to me is the closest to trying to mimic what is supposed to be in the original Godzilla, that fear of being helpless, of Godzilla just appearing, of the destruction of cities and things like that. But he's only in 2 levels. In particular here, I don't know how well that is showing up. But if you look just over the character in White's right shoulder, you can see his head coming out of the water. You're on a boat at this point, and he comes out of the water and like sinks the boat and these sorts of things. But in terms of anti-nuclear commentary, like it's not quite there, but it's still there. All right. I am not going to go through. I've got a couple of other games that I'm also like going to be writing about, but it's similar stuff. So that's one half of this project is, okay, this is what I want to write about. And now the other half of the project is, what am I going to make? What is it that I want to put together here to try and make some sort of anti-nuclear Godzilla commentary? And oh my goodness, have there been issues trying to put this part of it together. So on the right here, this is actually a picture from my office right now in all of its glory, and some of the equipment that I've been trying to set up in there to make to make some of this stuff. On the right, the game is Godzilla by Natsume Atari in 2015. This game is really interesting because it's not great, but if you try and find it on like eBay, it's like $1,000 because it came out at the very end of the PS3 generation. So it's a PS3 and a PS4 game. Both of them were produced in physical copy and have been delisted in their digital copies. So you just like can't get this anymore if you don't have it, or unless you've got $1,000. But I bought it back in the day, so it's still on my PlayStation account. So I get to write about it. But that leads into some of our equipment issues. So in trying to find a way to like capture the gameplay of some of these to be used in many different ways, I've had to be using different tools. So there's a PlayStation 3 on the very right there. That red and white box is called a Super Retro Trio 3 Plus, and then also has the plus symbol on there as well. So I don't know if it's Super Retro Trio 3 Plus Plus, but this is the way that they chose to market their product. The Super Retro will allow upscaling into HDMI of Nintendo Entertainment System, Super Nintendo Entertainment System, and Sega Genesis games. Upscaling into HDMI is important because that makes it much, much easier to capture video content. Using a capture card, which I have there, this Elgato HD60X capture card. With more modern or with more contemporary games, so anything like on the PlayStation 4 or later, a lot of the capture stuff is just built into the console. So you just take screenshots whenever you want, you record whenever you want, and you've got all the stuff that you need. On the PlayStation 3, they had something called HDCP, which scrambles any chance to capture this. So I wanted to capture some stuff from Godzilla. So the way that you do this is that you get a PlayStation, you get a capture card, and then use an HDMI splitter in order to capture the video. Which I couldn't get to work. So I went and asked the tech people about it and found out in this country that it's illegal. So I'm not going to be doing that. In Canada, it's fair use. In the US, apparently it's not fair use. So I'm kind of glad that it didn't work. And it's one of these things that's just like undercutting everything that I want to do right now are copyright issues, because I can't just make a game with Godzilla in it. I'm having trouble, as I was just saying, like recording imagery. Oh, good, the other presentation's done. So this has led me into these issues of like, okay, what am I actually going to be able to do with this? Now, I did have one major success in that I did get a copy of 1993's Super Godzilla from eBay for very, very cheap, and it didn't work. So I actually needed to crack it open and play around with it. But I did. I cleaned it, and luckily that's all that it needed, and I got it to work. Then beyond that, I was actually able to capture some video with it. And let's see if that's going to play. All right. I'm going a little bit over time, so you don't get to see the full like 4 minutes that I have here. But essentially, this one also doesn't have a ton of nuclear content. In this one, the Japanese self-defense forces have developed some sort of machine that allows them to control Godzilla. And then you go and fight a bunch of monsters as Godzilla, as Godzilla does. But that also becomes the gameplay of it, is that, oh, this is why you can control Godzilla, and you're like pretending that you're at like a computer console doing this. All right. So what are my preliminary conclusions and design goals moving forward? In terms of the game analysis, I already went over some of this, but Godzilla video games have a tendency to not include anti-nuclear elements in their gameplay design, their narrative, everything like that. This doesn't mean that Godzilla video games are not anti-nuclear, since the character is inherently so, but instead that they are not explicitly anti-nuclear, which is what I'm going to have to drill down in with my argument about like the anti-nuclear significance of Godzilla to game studies. Further case studies beyond the 5 selected games are going to be required, and I promise you it's a tough job, but I will play as many Godzilla video games as I need. I'll acquire as many of them as I need. I will make that sacrifice for all of you as I move forward in this project. But my early analysis shows that Japanese games may potentially have a deeper focus or tendency towards the anti-nuclear representation. This comes from City Shrouded in Shadow, and a little bit from the 2 games that I didn't talk about today, but they were more complicated case studies, so I just left that out. But I think that's something I might drill down on. It's possible as I play more of them that it's like, oh no, I found the outliers, and it's really not a thing that exists. So that's where I'm going to be focusing on my writing. So when it comes to my design goals and ideas, I have one general goal, is that I want to overtly and deliberately introduce anti-nuclear narrative into Godzilla video games. But as we've been talking about, there's a lot of copyright issues with this. There's technology issues, even in these early stages. So I'm coming up with design ideas of like what I want to do to accomplish this. One of the really easy ones would be a series of streams with guests that discuss Godzilla nuclear origins while playing through Godzilla games. I might just do this anyway because I think it would be pretty cool. But with getting things like this old Godzilla Super NES game up, and then maybe being able to acquire stuff where I can actually stream the games. It's a technology issue of getting like old GameCube and Wii games to work with it and the access to that. But I think that this is something that I'd like to do. I think that could be interesting. I also recognize that that's kind of like a really simple design solution. So there's a couple of other ideas that I've had. Design idea 2 is a hybrid piece that introduces playable content to classic games that implement anti-nuclear content. So the idea would be to very briefly, take some of the captured footage that I have and potentially put that into what is going in with like design idea 3 here, because it's very similar, into a game design tool. So having that in the background and inserting the commentary through either like writing your own stuff, drawing my own characters, and like implementing it that way, or making something more of a hybrid piece where so one would be playable and one would just be like a video version of it. So both of those would be options. One's more interactive than the other. However, making the interactive one, I don't know how that would work with copyright. I'm not going to try and make money off of it or anything like that. But as soon as I start releasing this, it's literally going to be like, I've taken a chunk from Super Godzilla and then implemented like gameplay functions in front of that. So I don't know how that would work. It's something that I need to work through. But one reason that I talked about the films so much today, those first 2 films, is that I had an idea while I was talking to a filmmaker that I know, also one of my former students. And I said jokingly that I would love to watch all of the new Godzilla movies and just insert my commentary into them, much like Raymond Burr in the original one. And she said that would be a great idea. But then I was like, no, I could make this a game. So the idea would be to Raymond Burr, myself, and other experts into these Godzilla games to enter commentary and to talk about the games and to play off of the idea that that was like a very horrible thing that was done in the 50s and to wink at that a little bit. Obviously, I would want to get more diverse voices in there. I don't know if I would require them to smoke the pipe, but I might get a pipe and require that as well. Coincidentally, if you see me just like walking around in the background of people's conversations, smoking a pipe from now on, I think that's just how I want to live my life. It worked for Raymond Burr. I think that it could work for me. So these are my ideas. This is what I want to argue. This is my general design. I have my goal, and now it's just a matter of implementation. And this is what I want to do with Godzilla, because I love Godzilla. But I do think that it's important to not let him just be a mascot and to have this anti-nuclear commentary, keep that in the gaming space, and to introduce that to as many people as possible through the medium. All right, thank you. There's my contact information, and I think I left time for like a couple of questions.